The first time my father hit me was the night my mother left. I remember it like it was yesterday. His bloodshot eyes, the disturbing smile plastered on his face, and the spittle on his lips from all the shouting. And, of course, the belt. I don't think I can ever erase the memory of that piece of leather as he raised it high above his head and brought it down in a burning slap across my bare arms. My mother had usually been around to protect me and Alice. She was our rock against the storm that was our old man, his temper that was prone to explode whenever we did anything stupid. A simple threat of taking away the farm, a massive 100-acre space of land that she had inherited from her father, was enough to stop my old man from carrying out his ruthless punishments. Looking back at it now, I believe I really had taken advantage of that, more than Alice had. It was easy to get away with things, and there was no love left between my parents for my mother to ever take his side. I never knew I had torn them apart, when the turning point in their 25-year relationship had come, but it didn't matter to me then. For a pubescent boy whose father couldn't discipline, my mother was my get-out-of-jail-free card, and I abused it. 3 weeks after my 13th birthday, I guess she had just had enough of it all. I can still picture her last night at home, how she sat in her chair out on the porch, sipping her usual iced tea and pretending I didn't know it was something stronger. "Off to bed, Garfield," she teased. She poked me in the belly that had awarded me the nickname, and despite the urge to remind her how much I hated being likened to an orange cat, that night I had let it slide. Sometimes I look back and wonder if maybe I should have spent more time with her on the porch that night. Maybe I would have known what she was up to and could have talked her out of it. But I didn't stay with her, and the next morning she was gone. Women are like that, I remember my father telling me why he rummaged through her closet, looking for God knows what. They're never satisfied. Now go wash your face and stop acting like a friggin' baby. He was never going to answer the multitude of questions swimming through my head, and Alice wasn't much help either. Our mother's departure had obviously hit her hard, and she spent most of her day numb to anything and everything around her. When she burned dinner, my father took his frustration out on her. I instantly regretted trying to stop him when the beatings began, and although they probably lasted only a few minutes, it felt like hours. It was almost as if he was beating me for every single mistake I had ever done, making up for the years my mother had stood up to him. I think back the weeks that followed that particular day, and sometimes wish he had killed me then and there. The Scarecrow came a week ago. By then the days had begun merging together, each the same as the other, until I really couldn't tell when one had ended and the next began. At some point, I had to check the calendar just to make sure my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, that a day truly had ended. It was proof that the sleepless nights I was experiencing, cowering under the covers while my father stomped around the house, drunk and angry, were finally over. The old man had started a reign of terror in our household. There was no telling what would set him off anymore. The smallest things ignited a fire so furious he would burst into a blinding rage and began a barrage of beatings. He would wake me at odd hours just to satisfy his urges, shouting and slapping until I had huddled in a corner with my hands up in defense and tears streaming down my face. The rising and settling of the sun was not enough to let me know that I had survived another day. But if I thought I had it bad, and back then I truly believed I did, then Alice had been living a nightmare. She had quickly been promoted to taking care of the things my mother once had responsibility for. However, without the threat of losing the farm, my father could voice his disapproval a lot more physically than he had been before. Some nights I could hear Alice crying in the room beside mine, and although I wanted to go to her to comfort her, I never could find the courage to do it. Other nights I would cower in my bed, shaking and sweating as my father stomped past the closed door to my room and barged into hers. She would scream, of course, shrills at times, muffled at others, and I could clearly hear the slaps my father would administer to shut her up. Whatever he was doing in there, the few minutes of listening to my sister's screams and my father's grunts seemed like a lifetime, and to this day they haunt my dreams. The Scarecrow was the only thing that seemed to break the cycle. I didn't know where it had come from at first, or why my father had suddenly decided that we needed one, but it looked horrific. The first time I laid eyes upon it, strolling out the back door and onto the small yard between the house and the cornfield, it had stopped me cold and sent chills up and down my spine. About 50 yards in the distance, crucified for eternity, it hung over the stalks of corn and stared right at me. I knew the notion was absurd, that there was no merit to how I felt the first time I saw the damn thing out in the field, but those days my emotions were in complete control over my mind, and no logical part of me ever considered speaking up and correcting the ludicrous imagination of a teenage child. A pile of hay, covered in my father's old clothes and my mother's Sunday hat. Still, I could swear those eyes were directed right at me, watching me, the smile drawn across his face with a black marker aimed in my direction. "Come out into the field, Garfield. Just a little closer, so I can tell you the funniest things you've ever heard. I have a few secrets to share, and I'm sure you're going to want to hear them." Want to know why Alice screams at night? Definitely not beatings, kiddo. I decided to stop venturing out into the backyard after that. I don't remember exactly when the nightmares began, but I do remember it was after Alice was taken to the hospital. My sister had fallen into complete silence by then, going about her chores with the numbness of a psych patient. She was on cruise control, working off instinct rather than actually paying attention to what she was doing, and even when I would try to talk to her, she would just look at me with an empty gaze. Whatever was left of her, whatever still had been labeled Alice, was lost somewhere, deep inside those eyes, locked away in a corner, where my father couldn't get to her. To me, she had slowly become nothing more than a walking corpse, and although it broke my heart to see her that way, there was very little I could do. It was the laundry, I think, that led to the beating. Alice had forgotten to empty out the pockets of my father's jeans and washed the $300 with the rest of the clothes. I had never seen my father that angry, and once the beating started, it took a very dangerous turn quickly. Alice had apparently become numb to my father's strikes as well. The more she failed to react to every slap, punch, and kick, the angrier he got. It all came to a shuddering halt when he grabbed her by the back of the head and slammed her face into the wall. The sheer volume of blood that was pouring out of her broken nose was enough to make me gag, and equally enough to snap my father out of his blind outburst. Coughing and sputtering, the blood seeping into the front of her shirt and turning her white blouse a crimson red. "Don't you move," my father shouted at me, suddenly overtaken by the urgency as he raced about the living room and grabbed his coat. They were out of the house in minutes, driving away just as the sun was settling. I watched from the front porch, my hands buried deep in my pockets, and for the first time since my mother had left, I contemplated running away. I had thought of it before, especially after the worst beatings, but always knew that somehow my father would find me, and the consequences would be severe. Now, though, I had a head start. He would be far too busy making excuses at the hospital for Alice's broken nose, and I would have the perfect window for the opportunity to escape. I had some money stowed away, enough for a one-way ticket to wherever the hell I wanted. I had no idea where to go or what I would do once I got there, but that didn't matter. What was important was getting away from here forever. I raced up the stairs to my room, closing the door behind me out of habit than anything else, the sounds of the empty house a bit too ominous for my liking. A few of the lights had burned out over the past week, and my father still hadn't gotten around to changing them. The dimmer illumination left shadows where none had been before, and it only made my urgency to leave stronger. I couldn't stay in this godforsaken place any longer. Thoughts of Alice suddenly crossed my mind, and the fear of what might happen to her if I left filled me. I stood motionless by the small desk near my window, my hands on the top dresser where $200 hid beneath my science book, awaiting to be retrieved and used. I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave her behind with that monster where his fury would go unchecked. This time he broke her nose. There was no telling what he might do next. The wind whistled through the window, and I closed the door with a shaking hand, frustrated and angry, knowing I would be forever stuck in this house as long as that man walked around freely. I thought about calling the police, but my father wasn't stupid, and he would somehow find a way out of trouble. My mind raced with possible solutions, but nothing seemed promising enough. I reached out to close the window over my desk, glancing briefly at the cornfield behind the house, when I froze in horror. The Scarecrow was perched in the backyard, hanging from its crucifix at an angle that allowed its eyes to stare up at my window, its black smile wider. I didn't sleep that night, hiding under my bed, even when I heard my father's truck drive up to the house and the sounds of Alice's soft footsteps walking up the stairs and into her room. I don't remember when I had finally fallen asleep, but I woke up with a start when my father pounded on my bedroom door the next morning, stormed into the room, and pulled me out from under the bed. "Did you move it?" he was shouting. "You good-for-nothing piece of shit. Did you move it?" He shook me so violently, my teeth rattled in my head, and my words came out in a stutter and gasps. He grabbed me by the collar of the shirt and dragged me downstairs and out to the back. I fought him, unable to break free of his grasp, but terrified enough to know I did not want to be anywhere near that damn thing. The Scarecrow was watching me with a smile, and when I looked up at it, now upright, as if it hadn't just been laughing at me last night, I felt my heartbeat race to a painful thundering pounding in my chest. "You carry it then," my father was screaming. "You think you're funny? You're going to carry it all the way back, or God help me, I'll string you up right next to it." To this day, I remember the splinters that punctured my skin as my father forced me to pull it up out of the ground with my bare hands. I remember trying not to look up at his horrible face and that awful smile as I leaned it onto my back. I remember the heaviness of it, as if I was carrying a sack of rocks instead of strands of hay. I remember my father barking orders as the sun's rays beat down on me, while I set the Scarecrow back in its regular place. The worst of it all was the feeling of the hay against my skin, the straw stroking the nape of my neck, and the wind blowing through the corn stalks as if the damn thing was breathing against me. I could imagine its smile behind me, its eyes boring into the back of my head. For a split second, I imagined its hands breaking loose from their ropes and wrapping around my neck, choking me to death as I carried it. My father didn't string me up next to it, but he did use his belt, and all the while my eyes kept seeing the Scarecrow's face on his, laughing manically as I cried out with every strike. Alice didn't come out of her room the whole day, and I found myself suddenly responsible for her chores. I think I gained a newfound respect for her after only a few hours of doing what she had to do every day. Of course, my father was always there, breathing down my neck, quick with a slap across the back of my head when he wasn't satisfied. But none of that fazed me. The memory of the Scarecrow in the backyard and the chore of carrying it back to its spot had left a lingering feeling of dread inside me, stronger than anything my father could say or do. Suddenly it felt as if the walls of the house were closing in on me, as if I was being boxed in with no prospect of escaping. At night I could hear Alice crying through the thin wall separating our rooms, and a part of me felt like I was abandoning her, even though I was only a few feet away. I had no idea if I could comfort her, if anything I could say would make up for the abuse she had experienced, and I was too scared to try. I heard my father's heavy footsteps climbing the stairs, and my eyes closed when he passed by my room and into Alice's. Within minutes, the grunting began, and although I tried to block it out, it kept me awake until it stopped. Alice's bedroom door opened and closed, and I listened as my father made his way back downstairs. I climbed out of bed, shaky with fury, angered at my helplessness, and ventured back to my desk and the secret stash. The money would be enough for both me and Alice. I could get us out of here, away from the farm and my father. There was enough for 2 tickets, and I was sure that once we were far away, Alice would return to her usual self, and we would both find a way to live out the rest of our lives without any problems. I looked up at my window, feeling my body being drawn to it slowly, dreading what I might see once I looked outside. I knew the logical thing to do was to crawl back under my bed and try to sleep, but some sick, twisted part of me wanted to take a peek and make sure that what had happened last night had not been repeated. I needed to believe that it had been some sick joke played by a couple of drunken teenagers looking for a good time. The alternative was too horrible to fathom. I walked to the window in small, tentative steps, and as I drew closer, and I could already see the cornfield beyond and the absence of the Scarecrow from the crucifix. My eyes scanned the backyard, goosebumps breaking out all over my skin, and cold fingers tracing the line down my spine. When I finally found the Scarecrow, it was laying on the step of the back porch, its face toward the sky, and its hollow eyes staring straight at me. I didn't wait for a beating. At dawn, when there was just enough sunlight to assure the shadows had been dispersed, but not enough to wake my father, I went out and carried the Scarecrow back. I went through the motions quickly, my eyes fixated on the destination as I tried my best to ignore the straws poking out and stabbing me in my arm. It was heavier than the last time, and after a few steps, I dropped it into the ground and dragged it through the corn the rest of the way. It took me almost a half hour to take the stake down, tie the Scarecrow up, and pull the whole thing back upright. By the end of it, the muscles in my back were screaming bloody murder. I hurried through the morning chores, fixing breakfast just as my father walked down into the kitchen. I braced myself as he stared at the eggs and the bacon with clear disgust before grunting and beginning to eat. "Don't," he said when I took a second plate and made my way towards the stairs. "She needs to eat," I replied. My father only had to look up from his food, and I trudged back to the kitchen table and sat down opposite of him. If I had known it was his last day alive, I might have acted differently. I remember 7th grade English class, when my teacher was discussing a fantastical story about a boy who went every night in the attic of an abandoned house playing with elves and fairies. The story was told from the point of view of a boy as an adult man returning to his childhood home, and how his memories turned out to be nothing more than a child's imagination. When I look back at the night my father died, I wondered just how much of it was imagination and how much was real. The day my father decided that Alice would not be fed, sitting at the kitchen table and eating his breakfast, was the day my entire world turned upside down. It was also one of the rare days he didn't beat me just for the hell of it, although there was a moment in the late afternoon when I thought he would stick his fist all the way down my throat. I avoided Alice's room like a plague, my mind selfishly content and excited that I would possibly go through 24 hours without having to endure my father's wrath. When I finally closed my bedroom door and crawled under the covers, a part of me sighed with relief. There might have even been a smile on my face, although that's one detail I could never remember. Anything else that happened that night is etched in my memory forever. It started with my father's usual trip to Alice's room, the stomping of heavy feet on the stairs, down the hallway, the creaking of the door opening, and the slamming sound of it closing again. And of course, the grunts. Although Alice had come to fall silent during the past few visits, that night her screams were shrill enough to make me jump out of my bed, and my heart beat like a hammer in my chest. Fists slammed against the wall over my head, and for a moment I truly believe I would see hands break through from the other side. I jumped out of bed hurriedly, stepping back away from the screaming and the pounding, from the angry shouts of my father, and the sounds of hard slaps coming from across the wall. My body shook uncontrollably, and my eyes stared in horror at the wall separating my room from Alice's. Her screams cut through the still night, as if she was right there in my room, kicking and lashing out at the man who had been abusing her for the past weeks. I felt frozen in place, unable to do anything more than listen to the sounds of my sister's screams. Something hard slapped against the wall, and Alice's screams stopped. In the sudden silence that followed, my beating heart was like a drum in my ears, and I fought hard not to race out of my room and into the night, away from the house and the horrors within. That's when Alice's door creaked open, and through the walls a shuffle of sheets and a flutter of feet followed. "What is this?" I heard my father say, his voice muffled, clearly out of breath. "Is this some kind of joke? How did you get this inside?" I felt a chill race up through me, and for some inexplicable reason, I rushed across the bedroom and to the window. I gazed out at the cornfield, squinting to see through the fog that had begun to settle around the house, and I knew what I would see before I saw it. The Scarecrow was missing. The sounds of my father's screaming froze the blood in my veins. I have never heard a man's cries of pain and terror so shrill before, and as I stared out of my window, my eyes fixated on the empty crucifix where the Scarecrow should have been, the screams turned into gurgling gasps of agony, followed by the sickening sound of breaking bones. A heavy thump followed, and the house fell into complete silence for a few seconds before I heard the sounds of Alice's door opening and closing, and the approaching sound of soft footsteps. I didn't turn around, my eyes staring straight through the window, my body beginning to shake uncontrollably. The footsteps stopped just outside my door, and through the reflection of the window, I watched in horror as the knob turned and the door swung open. The Scarecrow trudged into my room and stopped once it was a few feet inside. I couldn't turn, praying that if I stayed completely still, it might realize I was harmless and leave me alone. I had no idea what it had done to my father, but my imagination ran wild with lingering sounds I had been forced to hear just minutes before. My eyes were locked onto the reflection in the holes of its eyes, and for a quick instant I saw a flicker of movement there. The hat on its head hung askew, and between the straws I could see golden strands of blonde hair matted with mud. It spoke, and although its voice was horrifyingly muffled, as it had swallowed sand and was trying to speak through mouthfuls of it, there was a tone there that I recognized. "Go off to bed, Garfield. He won't hurt you anymore." They found me out in the cornfields, unconscious and shaking. The doctors called it conversion disorder, a result of the severe stress, and it took me years before I could finally speak and answer anyone's questions. They kept me isolated most of the time, and it was only after I was able to communicate properly that I found out what had become of my family. Alice was dead, beaten so badly that the damage to her organs and the internal bleeding were enough to make sure she had found a permanent escape from the clutches of our father. I miss her, and sometimes I wish I could find a way to tell her I'm sorry, that there was no excuse for my cowardice when I should have been there rushing in to save her. The monster that had been my father was found dead from multiple stab wounds. The police told me that most of the bones in his body had been shattered but what appeared to be a baseball bat. If the stabbing hadn't killed him, the bleeding would have. They had found both weapons in the cornfield as well. My mother had never left either. She was found covered in hay and old clothes, hanging from a crucifix in the middle of the cornfield, hidden in plain sight. She had been strangled to death weeks before, most probably by my father, and the police asked me several questions about their relationship in her last few days before giving up completely when I started to scream. I never really recovered from what happened, from what I saw. Until now, I still wake up screaming, locked away in my padded room, the effects of the medication wearing off faster every night. Sometimes when the lights are out and the illumination from the hall outside isn't enough to scare away the shadows, I can see the Scarecrow standing in a corner, watching me with its hollow eyes, and each time it would speak to me, "Go off to bed, Garfield."